What is strength? That's a great question, and it's something that I think that we need to understand when we talk about strength training. And I mean anyone who coaches people, anyone who's a personal trainer, anyone who puts out fitness and training advice. It's something that we need to understand and we need to define when we discuss the benefits of strength training, whether that's for your overall health, for fighting against cancer, for fighting against diabetes, heart disease, osteoporosis, all these things that we know based upon the scientific literature that's out there happens as a result of strength training. These are things it helps with to building muscle mass, to improving performance in a sport. And that doesn't have to be just some sort of weightlifting related sport, such as weightlifting, powerlifting, strength lifting. That applies to most sports. The vast majority of sports out there, you benefit from getting stronger. Now, in some cases, that might require strength without sacrificing things like speed or endurance, meaning there's a balance that has to be struck. But generally speaking, when we're discussing all these enormous number of benefits to strength training, we need to understand what strength is. And I think the best definition out there is that strength is the production of force against an external object. It's not something that's ambiguous or undefinable. That's what it is. It is the production of force against an external object, whether that's a barbell, whether that's a rock, a tree that's fallen on one of your loved ones, whether it's even against a machine or against an opponent on a playing field, right? That's strength. It's a production of force. You could even be throwing a ball, right? Throwing an object. Strength will determine how hard you can throw or push or pull those things. That's what strength is. And so when we talk about strength training, that doesn't necessarily mean always training for a 1 rep max. And I think it's important to understand that the strength is strength, and there is such a thing as just general strength, but strength is also specific. In other words, if we didn't want specific strength at different joint angles and movement patterns, we wouldn't need to train any of those things, would we? If all that mattered was getting strong and it carrying over to everything, if strength wasn't specific, then we could all just deadlift, right? We just do the deadlift and we wouldn't need to do anything else. But you have different movement patterns, and that's why I usually recommend multiple movement patterns that we strength train through. And that's things like a squat, a hip hinge, a vertical push, a horizontal push, a vertical pull, a horizontal pull. All right, these are your basic movement patterns as far as relatively full range of motion movements. So when we think in terms of strength training, we're talking about getting stronger through these various movement patterns. That's what we're talking about. So what does that comprise? Well, the two things that are going to determine strength, well, really three things once you start counting personal leverages, but it's going to be the amount of muscle tissue involved. In other words, tissue hypertrophy directly correlates to strength gains. Every study that's ever looked at it has repeatedly found this, and the only thing that seems to particularly skew these ratios other than a small amount is anabolic drugs, right? That's it, anabolic drugs. That people who abuse significant amounts of anabolics can gain muscle faster than they would gain proportionate strength. For anyone else out there, hypertrophy is always accompanied with a corresponding amount of strength. And for any given movement pattern on a person, the muscles involved, you're going to see a pretty consistent ratio. In other words, you're going to see the same amount of strength gain with your individual leverages on an exercise with an exact amount of muscle being gained in those muscles involved, right? Every single time. So we have the muscle mass component, and then we have the motor unit learning and neural efficiency part, which is has a lot to do with the joint angle specificities, like it getting stronger at different angles in your joints. It has to do with learning the actual movement pattern, such as learning how to perform a barbell squat or a power clean or a bench press. So you have all of those things to factor in, but interestingly enough, when we start dealing with single joint exercises, actually strength is derived almost entirely from what? muscle size. Muscle size. In other words, if we lock someone into a machine curl, or we lock them into a leg extension machine and we measure, say, their 10 rep strength, and we go away from the singles, because 1 rep maxes also tend to have a higher dependence on joint angle specificity and movement pattern. Single joint exercises, which a lot of people try to call isolation movements, they're just a result of muscle mass. In other words, if your bicep or your quads are bigger, you just see a direct proportion there in your higher rep strength, because there is no real skill involved. There's no skill involved with hitting a 10 rep max on bending your elbow or bending your knee, right? So all the motor pattern stuff tends to go out the window, particularly when we go away from hitting a really heavy 1 rep max also, because that has a learning curve to it. And it becomes just an issue of how big the muscle is. So a bigger muscle is always a stronger muscle. Bigger muscle is always a stronger muscle. And that's something that we have to understand when we're structuring training or looking for people's results. And when you look at that, and we do see that that's the case, it should make sense to people who are even trying to change their physique, that tension, direct tension, will correlate with muscle mass in a very direct and real way. So a large portion of strength training is going to be geared towards hypertrophy. And that's actually the reason we see most of the health benefits, isn't it? Not necessarily the osteoporosis and the bone mineral density, but all the stuff that affects blood work, things that affect your metabolism, things that affect your insulin sensitivity from sensitized muscle that's growing. That all has to do with the direct hypertrophy from strength training. It has to do with the direct hypertrophy. It's how much muscle you gained. Gaining muscle is beneficial to your health. And I'm not talking about when you're getting steroid big. I'm talking about gaining muscle as in if any untrained person were to spend the next 2 to 3 years gaining as much muscle as humanly possible on their frame, it will improve all of their health outcomes. It will reduce their chances of almost every single disease that we think of, ranging from heart disease to cancers to diabetes. All these terrible afflictions are dramatically reduced by doing that, all of them. And they'll be able to eat more food while carrying less body fat. So even for weight loss, it's of value. But what we have to understand also is that without strength involved and a programmed manner in which you can continue to progressively overload, you don't continue to see significant hypertrophy. So they correspond in that you need these bigger movement patterns that have motor patterns involved with them. They're the ones that you can train the longest and continue to see progress that's going to continue to stimulate muscle growth. In other words, if you were to take someone and have them do nothing but single joint exercises in a machine, their strength is going to stagnate very quickly, which in turn will mean that their muscle growth is going to stagnate very quickly. And that's one of the big reasons we see in gyms young men who try to do too many of these bodybuilder style training protocols end up going on steroids a lot sooner than they really would need to, even to reach their own personal goals. And they do it because the training modalities are just ineffective, because they're not really strength training. And without strength training, the natural lifter is going to gain muscle slower. They're going to plateau more often, right? Because they're not able to continually increase tension on the muscle over time and workload to the same degree. So strength training is comprised of a lot of things, but our biggest focus on strength training is always going to be learning movement patterns and causing direct tissue hypertrophy. Because at the end of the day, that is what we're trying to do with strength training. We're trying to cause structural changes in the organism, and we're trying to improve performance. Irrespective of what we are doing, the two always feed hand in hand. In other words, if you want to make an athlete stronger, you probably need to put some muscle on them. If you want to put muscle on someone for cosmetic or health reasons, you need to make them stronger. So they correlate completely. And what you're going to find is that your movement patterns, your muscle mass, and your individual leverages are what is going to determine your strength in any given movement pattern at any given time. That's what's going to determine it. And that, again, that strength being defined as the production of force against an external object, or how much force you can produce against that object. And those are the factors that matter. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.